Hello and welcome to today's webinar on getting audit ready with effective strategies for managing electronic records. This webinar is being brought to you by us here at IdeaGen. We're a leading provider of software solutions and software validation services for highly regulated industries. Our quality management software is trusted by laboratories across the globe to manage compliance with ISO standards such as 9001 and ISO 17025. Before we get going, please let me share a few housekeeping items. The webinar will last for about an hour, with roughly 40 minutes of presentation by our speaker and 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. After the Q&A, we will be showing a short snippet demonstration of our IdeaGen Quality Management Essentials Edition for those of you who would like to find out more about our QMS software straight away. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see an icon labeled questions. You can submit your questions at any time during the webinar, and we'll look to get as many of those answered as possible during the Q&A. If we are unable to do so, please reach out to us directly using the Contact Us form on the IdeaGen website. Under the question icon, you can see a poll icon, and I can see that a few of you have already submitted your answers. Thank you very much for that. If the rest of you would be able to do so as well, we'd really appreciate to understand what's important to you when managing your records and getting audit ready. From the lobby where you joined the session, there are also some useful free resources on ISO 17025, and I'd highly recommend you seek out IdeaGen's ISO 17025 Knowledge Hub, where we have a range of free downloads for you to help broadening your understanding. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and we will be able to provide an on-demand session to you. This will be emailed after this webinar, and you're welcome to share this with anybody you think would benefit from this session. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. I'd like to warmly welcome Melanie Ross. Melanie is a technical products developer at ANAB, where she expertly designs and delivers training courses and supports client outreach through business development activities. Melanie has over 20 years of experience in quality assurance, quality control, and quality management, and she has worked in several different industries, including chemical, biological, oil and gas, and aerospace. Her main role in each of these industries was the development of management systems, including internal audit programs, vendor qualification procedures, and implementation of Lean Six Sigma. Melanie, we are so pleased you're joining us today again and sharing your expertise with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Morena. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today for this joint webinar with IdeaGen and ANAB. I appreciate you taking the time to learn about how to manage electronic records. What we're going to be doing during our webinar today is we are going to define what an electronic record actually is. We will look at some of the ISO requirements related to electronic records and discuss how those requirements are similar across different ISO standards. We're also going to look at some of the components of electronic records management systems and learn some strategies for managing electronic records. As Morena said, there is a Q&A panel that you can enter your questions as we go through this webinar. So if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them so we can answer them at the end of the presentation. So we first start with defining what is a record. There are a plethora of definitions of what a record is, but basically, in the basic form, a record is a collection of data. And that data could be anything. It could be names, it could be places, it could be measurement results. Any type of data that's collected by an organization is then captured in a record. Another definition is a document stating results achieved or providing evidence of activities performed. That providing evidence for anyone that's ISO certified or accredited to an ISO standard, that evidence can be that objective evidence to verify or confirm that your management system meets requirements. The next definition is document, providing information on observations or activities performed. So it's very similar to that second definition, but now we're talking about information on observations. So oftentimes we think of data as the hard numbers. We run a measurement, we produce a product, we provide a training, but our records can also be our observations, those things that we see as we're doing our work. And then the last definition here on this slide is related data treated as a unit of information. When we look at a more official definition of a record, this can be recorded information, regardless of media or characteristics, created, received, and maintained as evidence and information by an organization or person in the transaction of business. So you can see with this definition of record, it really encompasses a lot of different types of organizations and a lot of different information that's being gathered in the day-to-day operations of our business. What I want to point out here is it says regardless of media or characteristics. And that's where we're going to start delineating between paper records and electronic records, because the way those records are maintained and retained are different, because electronic records have different requirements for them and different nuances in how you have to manage those records. I do want to point out one term that's used in a lot of the ISO standards, and I believe it started with ISO 9001 when it revised in 2015, is this term documented information. So what is documented information? It's information required to be controlled and maintained by an organization and the medium on which it is contained. So just like the definition on the previous slide, it can be any format, it can be any media, and it can be any source. So when we talk about documented information from an ISO standard perspective, what that means is documents and records. And oftentimes organizations have difficulty understanding what is the difference between a document and a record. And I have a slide here that points out some of those differences. So a document is information used to support, it says here laboratory operations, but it can really be organizational operations. So that document is a policy, a procedure, those forms that we use day to day. It can be our organizational charts, our work instructions. What we want to note here is that documents can change, and documents should change. All ISO standards have documentation requirements where they say the document should be periodically reviewed and updated as necessary. So we want to make sure that our documents are up to date, and that's how they change throughout time. When we look at the box for record, this is data collected and evidence about a past event. So again, that term evidence, it's our objective evidence that something occurred. It's the data that we collect during our day-to-day operations. It can be our minutes or reports or certificates, survey results, manufacturing records, bench sheets, all of those things that provide us the evidence that an event occurred. That second bullet there says records do not change. And you may be thinking, wait a minute, records can change. We can amend records. Yes, you can, but that original record remains as the original observation. It does not change. A new record is created, or an amended record is created. And we're going to get into that in a little bit further into the presentation. But when we look at the difference between a document and a document becomes a record once data is entered and it's saved in its final form. So you think about those forms that you have as part of your operations. You may have a log sheet. That is a document that's created in your document management system and is managed through your document control process. Once that document is used in the day-to-day operations to log information on it and it's saved, that's when it becomes a record. So now we want to delineate what is an electronic record. The definition for an electronic record is any combination of text, graphics, data, audio, pictorial, or other information that is created, modified, maintained, archived, retrieved, or distributed by a computer system. So when we think about those last four words, by a computer system, we look at the words in front of it. An electronic record can be created by a computer system where it stays in that computer system from start to finish, or it could be archived. So we may have paper records that we're filling out, that log sheet, for example, filling out by hand and then scanning it as an electronic record. Or maybe we're writing information down on a form and then transcribing it into that computer system. When records are maintained in our electronic system is when we need to give consideration for how those records are going to be maintained and retained, and how those records can be amended as needed. I mentioned a few of these already, but what are some types of records that we may be considering as part of our electronic records? Again, those could be those manufacturing details or our batch records if we're performing testing on our materials. It can be our internal audits, right? We generate records for our internal audits, and all ISO standards require those records to be retained in some manner. It could be our customer complaints or those process improvements that we're implementing in the organization. One thing that all organizations should have is those personnel records. So types of records could be our competence on personnel. Those records could be electronic if, for example, you provided a test or a quiz or some sort of demonstration of competence that is captured electronically. In that case, you may have a combination of paper and electronic records, and you'll need to give consideration of how that full record package is going to be maintained by the organization. And again, like we saw on our slide of documents versus records, it can be reports or meeting minutes or any other piece of information that represents that something has occurred, that an event has occurred, and it's that evidence of that occurrence of the event. When we look at creating electronic records, we can create them in a lot of different ways. I mentioned that first box previously. We could scan paper records. We scan them as a PDF, and they live as that original record in an electronic form. In that case, we may still keep that paper record as a backup, but have the electronic record for reference, for future reference. It can be equipment and instrument software. They can be generated as spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are considered electronic records. It could be an electronic document management system like the one that IdeaGen provides. That means that your SOPs, your work instructions, all of the documents that you generate are maintained in an electronic system. You take those documents, add data, and they become records. And then it could be just an information management system or an enterprise resource system that you have, maybe that generates your workflow. So a customer provides a sale, they provide a purchase order, and then you put it into a system that tracks that purchase order through to completion. Other types of electronic records that we may not necessarily consider in our day-to-day operations as evidence. One of the big ones is emails. So as part of our review of requests, tenders, and contracts, if you're a 17025 accredited laboratory, those emails could be a part of that contract review. So you have to give consideration to how are you going to archive those emails as part of your record. It could also be your websites. So if you need a record of the catalog of items that you're providing to individuals, that website may be your catalog. So how do you archive that information? Again, it can be those Excel documents or Word documents. It could be digital receipts. Another one to consider is text or chat messages. A lot of organizations use Microsoft Teams or WebEx Chat or Slack or some other system to send messages back and forth. What messages need to be retained as an electronic record and what are just general day-to-day discussions with personnel. And then another one that some organizations use is those Google documents. How are you going to maintain those Google documents, and what are the requirements for modifying those Google documents and capturing the amendments to those documents as they occur? When we look at ISO requirements for records, there are common elements that are in most ISO standards. So ISO 9001 in 2015 generated the ISO Proc 33, which contains common elements that are required for all ISO standards. Now, it's not necessarily for the ISO IEC standards, such as 17025 or 17020, but the ISO committees for those standards has decided to adopt the common elements in ISO Proc 33. It forms the base requirements in ISO 9001 for a quality management system. And it stands to reason that the working groups decided to implement Proc 33 for those ISO IEC 17000 series standards because Clause 8 in those standards is management system requirements. And gathering those requirements and putting them into those standards allows for organizations to have multiple certifications and accreditations that have those base requirements in it. We're going to look at those base requirements, and then we're also going to look at some of the additional requirements that are in those specific standards. So when we think about 17025, for example, yes, we have the control of records requirements in Clause 8. But there's also requirements for technical records. There's requirements for control of information and management systems. So we have to look at those additional requirements that are in specific standards as well. I put 3 here on the slide, but there are many, many other ISO standards, and not just ISO 9001 for management systems. There's environmental management, occupational health and safety. Because of ISO Proc 33 and those common elements, it's much more easier for organizations to consistently manage their records for all of the operations that are being performed, from manufacturing to testing to inspection to final reporting, because the requirements on the base of it are all the same. So the ISO 9001 requirements for records for control of documented information are found in 7.5.3. And specifically in 7.5.3.1, we have to control required documented information to ensure it is available and suitable for use, where and when it is needed, and it is adequately protected. So there's a lot of requirements in this one sentence. Now remember, documented information includes our documents and our records. So this requirement is for the control of records. We want to make sure it's available and the records are available and suitable, and that it's adequately protected. Now, adequately protected is very vague. So it depends on the organization to determine what record or what is adequately protected for their records, depending on the type of record. That might sound very similar to risk. So organizations need to evaluate risk related to record control to determine what is the best approach to manage those records and protect the records. When we go further to 7.5.3.2, organizations need to address the distribution, access, retrieval, and use, and specifically here we're talking about records, the storage and preservation, including preservation of legibility, the control of changes, and retention and disposition. That control of changes becomes complicated with electronic records depending on the systems that are being used. If the record is scanned, then changing that record, you would change the paper record and rescan it. But when we talk about records that are generated in electronic systems and modified or amended in electronic systems, that's when it gets to be a challenge. The other piece is this retention and disposition of records. Remember, I said a record remains a record once it's saved. A record becomes a record once it's saved. We then ask the question, when does it stop being a record? And we're going to look at that when we look at the retention and disposition of records here in a little bit. Additional ISO requirements for control of records come from other ISO standards. We want to establish and retain legible records to demonstrate fulfillment of requirements. So we already talked about legible records with the 9001 requirements. Now we're looking at our records that demonstrate fulfillment of requirements. Remember, it's our documented evidence of a past event, documented evidence that something occurred. Then we use that evidence to say, do we meet those requirements or not? We need to implement controls needed for identification, storage, protection, backup, archive, retrieval, retention time, and disposal. So you can see, even with these additional ISO requirements, they still stack on top of those common element requirements, all with the end goal of ensuring we have records in place so that we can demonstrate requirements are fulfilled and that those events occurred. We need to ensure that amendments can be tracked to previous versions or to original observations, retaining both original and amended files. Remember, records don't change. That initial record needs to be retained as that initial evidence of the event occurring. When amendments are needed, we then either generate a new record or document what was changed. When we talk about accessing electronic records, we want to make sure that we're organizing those records for future reference. Our requirements in our ISO standards say that those records need to be readily available and they need to be used in a manner to demonstrate that requirements were fulfilled. So we want to make sure that we are organizing those records in a way that makes sense, especially if you have a combination of electronic versus paper, or your electronic records are stored in multiple systems. So when we talk about future reference, there's a lot of different activities that reference those records. One of our activities is our internal audits. During internal audits, we review records to ensure that those requirements were fulfilled. The same with our external assessments or our external audits. We want to make sure that our records are readily available and organized in a way that demonstrates fulfillments of requirements so those external audits or assessments go smoothly. Those electronic records may also be accessed for customer complaints. We want to make sure that we have those manufacturing records, those measurement records in place and easily found and identified so that if a customer does complain, we can backtrack what happened to determine if that complaint is valid and if a corrective action or correction is needed. We want to also reference those records to identify future training needs of our personnel. We need to control access of our records for confidentiality, impartiality, and the integrity of those records. So when we're thinking about electronic records, it can go from just a drive on your shared drive. It can go into a system like ShareFile or SharePoint, or it could be a sophisticated electronic records management system that has lots of controls in place. But when you're looking at your electronic record system, you want to make sure that you're looking at that confidentiality requirement and the impartiality and integrity of those records, however they are stored. What is an electronic records management? Or what is electronic records management, or ERM? It's an automated technique or techniques to manage the creation, distribution, use, amendment, and disposal of records. So an official electronic records management system will have specific components in it. But if we have a homegrown system or a combination of things that we use, Excel files, shared files, things like that, then we need to take in consideration these components of that electronic records management system as well. We need to put into place a retention schedule. How long do we retain these electronic records? Because it's very easy for electronic records because they take up so much little space. They're not filing cabinets in a room. It's easy to retain them forever. But we need to look at our contractual and legal requirements for the retention of those records. What are our policies and procedures around generation of records and amending records? The accessibility, indexing, and storage is also a component of our ERM system. And then conformity auditing to ensure that that system is functioning properly. And then on the back end of that retention schedule is disposal of those obsolete records. When we look at further requirements that can help guide us in using electronic records management systems, we can look to 17025 7.11.2, where the laboratory information management system used for the collection, processing, recording, reporting, storage, or retrieval of data shall be validated for functionality, including proper functioning of interfaces with the laboratory information management system by the laboratory before introduction. Right? So we're looking at validating the functionality of that system to make sure that it does work the way that it's supposed to. Access controls are in place. Individuals only have access to those records that they're supposed to have access to. That if there are any interfaces within those that electronic management system, that those interfaces are tested as well, so that we see data from point A goes into point A in the electronic management system. And then when we look at 7.11.3, we want to make sure that our electronic records are protected from unauthorized access, that we safeguard against tampering and loss of those electronic records, think accidental deletion, that our system is operated in an environment that complies with specifications. So if we have hard drives that are being maintained, that the environment those hard drives are in are suitable to ensure that the hard drives don't crash or are in the correct environmental conditions. We maintain that system to ensure the integrity of the records. And we include a recording system for failures so that we can do appropriate, immediate, and corrective actions. This system failures is one of the ones that's more difficult for organizations to wrap their mind around, especially if you're saving your records just in a drive, like in a folder, in a network folder, for instance, is what failures could there be? Could someone accidentally delete the record? How would you know? So you have to give consideration to that, not just from a 17025, it's a requirement within 17025, but from a risk perspective within your organization. Because again, those records document evidence that an event occurred, and we don't want to lose those records. When we look at implementing electronic records management, we want to develop our records management policy. We want to evaluate our records management system or systems. Take a look at what you have or what you're planning on getting to ensure that it meets the needs of that management policy. We assign responsibilities, authorities, and access to our electronic records management. We verify that functionality. We transfer our records as needed. We train our personnel, and then we implement our records management system. So we want to make sure that if we are implementing a brand new electronic records management system, that transfer of records is a planned activity and that you ensure those records transfer effectively. Obviously, personnel need to be trained to not only use the system to access records, but also use the system to generate records. I've mentioned a few of these already, so I won't stay on this slide long, but our strategies for managing electronic records, we could use portable hard drives or external storage devices. We could use cloud storage, and that could be on-site or it could be an external provider. Extra considerations are given if you're using an external provider, because that external provider needs to conform or comply to your requirements. So you need to make sure that they have the capability to enforce that confidentiality, the impartiality, and the integrity of the records when those records are stored offsite. When we look at electronic records management as a process flow, we look at the creation of the record. Is it created hard copy? Is it created electronically? Then we look at the storage and security. How are we going to store those records, again, as the previous slide, and how are those records secured? On the other side of that is, how do we use those records? What are they going to be used for? Is it just archive only? Is it to prepare for an external audit or assessment? Is it for day-to-day use and reference? And how we maintain them? And then that final disposition again. I mentioned amending records and that it's a little more challenging to amend electronic records depending on what system you're using. We amend electronic records for several different reasons. It could be typographical errors, it could be editorial errors, it could be non-conforming data, or any other type of amendment that we need to make. And for each of these different types of amendments, it may be a different process flow that you're following. So a typographical error, maybe you entered the customer name wrong. Well, that doesn't really necessarily change the evidence of the event that occurred. We're just correcting that typographical error. It's still an amendment to a record. The original record needs to be retained and the new record retained as well. Those editorial errors, maybe we put in the numbers backwards. So again, those are kind of those types of errors there. And then when we look at non-conforming data, that means that the evidence of the event that occurred was inaccurate or incorrect, right? So we find that we've entered data that does not reflect the event that occurred, or the event that occurred was non-conforming. So we have to give consideration to each of these different types of amendments. We saw in our ISO requirements that amendments to records must be tracked to the previous versions or original observations. We retain that original and the amended version. We want to include a date of alteration, indication of altered aspects, and the personnel responsible for those alterations. And when we say retain original and amended version, if you think about a paper record, if you're just amending that record, you're crossing something out, you're initialing and dating it, and you're writing the correct information in, or the amended information into that record. So the original and the amended version are one and the same. When we think about electronic records, so we think about an Excel document. We've generated an Excel document as evidence that an event occurred, and we need to modify it. You need to give consideration to just going into that file, making the change, and saving it, overwriting the previous file, because then the original version of that record is no longer retained. So we have to think about that when we're modifying or amending electronic records. How are you going to include the date of alteration, what was altered, and who made that alteration? Then we look at final disposition of records. This means our retention, how long are we going to retain them? The disposal, how are we going to get rid of them? And the destruction, how are we going to ensure that that record no longer exists? When we look at retention, this is defining the retention time that is aligned with our contractual arrangements. So the slide says contractual arrangements, but sometimes that could be legal requirements for retaining records. You think about a doctor's office, they have to retain patient records for a certain period of time. Once that time is up, then they need to find a way to dispose of and destroy or destruct those records. Again, oftentimes with electronic records, what we see is that organizations retain those records indefinitely. You need to weigh the risk of retaining those records for an extended period of time. Organizations are bound by contracts and by legal requirements, by ethical requirements, and by their own internal requirements as well. And you need to look at those requirements and really consider how long should you be retaining those records. And it may be different depending on what type of record it is that's being retained. So a record is a record as long as it is retained. If you retain a record indefinitely, then that record could be accessed for any reason indefinitely. So if you think of legal obligations, like those patient records, if a doctor's office retains those patient records indefinitely, then the patient has access to those records indefinitely. If the requirement is 10 years and they dispose of them after 10 years, they've met their requirement. So you need to consider that once a record reaches the end of its defined retention time, you want to destroy it and or dispose of that record. For electronic records, that could be deleting the file. You need to also consider, though, data backups, multiple copies, or multiple locations of that electronic record. If you are destroying or disposing of an electronic record that could potentially have been saved elsewhere, maybe on a personnel desktop or their own files, that record is deleted or destroyed in all locations that it exists. When we look at the benefits of electronic records management, it reduces our paper filing cost. Right? We don't have filing cabinets. We're not paying for external storage of those paper records. And it also protects those records from natural disasters such as fires or fire extinguishers or fire sprinklers. It protects those records from sitting on a desk and getting coffee spilled on it. But it does bring other challenges in with those disasters as well. Oftentimes, electronic records are easier to organize because it's easier to move files around digitally than it is to move papers around physically. It can facilitate information lookup depending on how you have your filing system set up. If you're using an electronic records management system, they probably have lookups or searches where you could search for keywords or specific file names. It eliminates the wear and tear. So if you have a specific record that's accessed often, when it's electronic, it's not touched as a paper record would be. We can also broaden our access to those records. So if you have multiple locations and you had paper records, those would be stored at one location. But if we have them as electronic, we can access those records from multiple locations through that remote sharing. And then we also have that system backup functionality with electronic records that just isn't there with those paper records. When we look at the challenges for managing electronic records, we could have technical problems. We could get files that are lost. We could get files that are overwritten. When we look at downtime, what if the electronics records management system, we need Wi-Fi to access, and that Wi-Fi is down? Or the system needs maintenance. IT has notified us this system's going to be down for this period of time. If you have that prior notification, you can plan for that. But if that downtime is unexpected, then that could impact your day-to-day operations. We also have to consider unauthorized access, and that means both internally and externally. We think of those pirates that come and hack your data and then ask for a ransom for that data in order to get your access back. So you have to consider the risk of unauthorized access as well. Then it could be incompatibility. If we're storing electronic records for a long period of time and the system upgrades, say Microsoft decides to go to a new platform for Excel and our old files are no longer readable. So you need to consider that as part of your risk of managing electronic records. Again, that data security and privacy is a big one. So unauthorized access goes along with that. And then we talked about tracking amendments. We need to make sure that we are tracking those. And one that's not so much anymore is the resistance to change. If someone's used to having that paper in their hand, they may be reluctant to come on board with putting that paper into an electronic system. So in conclusion, we want to organize, store, and manage documented information to ensure it can be easily accessed, shared, and used. We need to make sure that we understand one size does not always fit all. And that statement is heavy. So one size does not always fit all organizations, but one size does not always fit all records either. We want to make sure that we're implementing records management policies, principles, or procedures that are relevant to our organization and the activities that we perform. We ensure responsibilities and authorities are assigned and understood, and we evaluate the system periodically to ensure conformance. It's not a one and done. We want to make sure that we're continuously looking at that as part of our internal audits, our management review. It's looked at as part of our external audits as well. So before we get to your questions and to give you time to enter your questions if you have any, I just want to go over some additional resources that ANAB has available for organizations. On our website, we offer free webcasts on a variety of different topics. Most of the topics are laboratory related, but we do have one that comes to the top of my head is the do's and don'ts of management review, which could apply to any organization that's performing management review. We also have a blog on the website listed here, blog.ansi.org, has a variety of different topics. And again, some of them are general interest topics like internal audits and proficiency testing, things like that. We also do webinars monthly. We partner with IdeaGen to do webinars several times a year, but we also have our own webinars that we do every month. And then we offer a variety of different trainings in the conformity assessment arena on standards, accreditation requirements, internal auditing, things like that. We have a new course right now that I wanted to talk about was our internal auditing intensive workshop. This workshop is standard neutral. It focuses on the requirements of ISO 19011 and goes through what are the attributes of an auditor, how to develop an audit program, and how to perform those audits with a deep dive into workshop exercises that is the bulk of the course. We just opened 2 new sessions of that course, so take a look at our website if you're interested in taking that workshop. Now we will get to your questions. Like Marina said, we have 20 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please enter them into the question panel. We've had a couple come in. We have one that are completed paper records that are scanned still the original records, or are the scan files, or both? Now that's dependent on your record control policy and procedure. If you retain that original piece of paper, then that is your original record. If your policy says the scanned file is verified to match the paper file and the paper file is discarded, then that original scan would be the original file. So this is where I said one size doesn't fit all. It really depends on how your organization sets up their record control policy and what works for you from a risk perspective. Then we have a question, I think would be more for Marina. Would it be possible to request a demo from IdeaGen for document control solutions?
Yes, absolutely. I've just responded in the back end as well. We have a short snippet of a demonstration after finishing this Q&A. So if you want to stay on to just get a snippet of what our ICUM Essentials, IdeaGen Quality Management Essentials document management module looks like, please stay on. In any other case, I'll make sure to follow up with the person that asked the question separately so we can get that booked in for you.
Great, thank you. One other question that I wanted to address was what types of electronic record management systems are out there. One that can be used is IdeaGen. It is a document management system, but it also has workflows that can be used to manage electronic records. There are a lot of different ways to do it. I've seen it from just files on a shared drive through to using ShareFile or SharePoint to systems like IdeaGen or SAP Concur that puts all of your enterprise resource planning into one area. And it can also be a combination of those things. So IdeaGen can be used for a lot of different types of records, like training records. Their workflows and training module are good for retaining personnel competence records. So that may be in combination with your manufacturing records that are in a different system. So it really is a good idea to sit down and map out what are the records that you are generating, what's the best way to retain them, and what's the best system to fit that need. And then we had another one come in for the scans that are considered original records. Should paper copies be destroyed, retained as backups, or etc.? Again, that's really unique to your organization and your confidence in the electronic records management system that you have and the risk level that your organization is willing to tolerate. So if you say that original paper record is scanned, we verify that it is the scanned record, and we destroy it, then that's a risk to the organization that that piece of paper is no longer in existence. And you want to make sure that that electronic scan is reflective of that original record before it is, or that piece of paper before it is destroyed. I know I worked for an organization that went through a process of scanning all of their paper records because they had a lot of paper records stored off-site with a vendor. And they would scan the record. They would wait to make sure that it was published in their electronic records management system. A second person would review it to make sure the entire record was there. It wasn't just one piece of paper, it was a whole batch file. And then once that was confirmed, that paper record was destroyed. Now, they documented that as a risk in their risk assessment process, that if that electronic record ever was compromised, the paper record is no longer there for backup, but it was a risk that they were willing to retain to eliminate the paper record footprint that they had, the amount of paper that they had stored. So again, one size doesn't fit all. You need to sit down with your organization and look at your record control policy, your contractual arrangements, any legal requirements, and then go from there is what fits best for your organization.
Thank you, Melanie. We still have a couple of minutes to go, so if anybody else would like to submit some more questions, please feel free to do so.
Well, while we're waiting, I just want to thank everyone for coming to the webinar, listening to this. Again, it will be it is recorded, and it will be issued out to you by Adiagen. We'll also have it on our website or a link to it from our website. And I do have some contact information here for ANAB. If you are interested in training, you can email that email address there. I love all the clapping hands. That's great. If you are interested in accreditation, you can email that anab@anab.org. Or if you have any additional questions that you didn't get to ask here, if you email that, it comes directly to me, so I can get that question answered for you and let Marina know what questions we had as well. We did get one more question come through. Is laboratory information management system as records? I mean, you can use a laboratory information management system as your record management if it has that component. You just need to ensure that confidentiality, access control, all of those considerations from the requirements for record control. Then it says, which ISO will be directly responsible for electronic records? So the ISO Proc 33 just has general requirements for record management. Where we see that the requirements for laboratory information management systems that then go into electronic records, that comes more into those technical standards like 17025. We anticipate 17020 as it is modified. So really, it's any ISO standard that has record control where you have electronic records. So if your records are electronic, records control requirements are for those electronic records. And then someone asked, are we providing a certificate for this webinar? This is a free webinar, so it doesn't provide continuing education credits or continuing education units as a free webinar. So we do not issue certificates of attendance to the webinar.
All right.
So I will stop sharing.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. As mentioned, thank you very much, Melanie, for this really insightful and very thorough journey through managing electronic records. I can see we've answered all the questions in the chat. Again, as Melanie said, please feel free to reach out to Melanie directly with the email address that was just provided, or to ourselves by submitting a form via the Contact Us button on the website. This webinar is going to be immediately available to view on demand after this session, so please feel free to rewatch or reshare, and we'll be sending out an email with the link as well. So without further ado, I will say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us and for staying on with us. And I will click on the start button to show you a little snippet of our quality management system now. Thank you very much, Melanie, and we'll see you soon, I'm sure.
Thank you.
IdeaGen Quality Management Essentials Edition, or IQM Essentials, is an all-in-one EQMS compliance management solution. One of the core functions of the platform is our document management module, which was designed to support organizations with the likes of ISO 17025 and ISO 9001. Let's take a look at how the IQM Essentials system supports organizations with their document management, focusing largely on the document life cycle. So to do this, we navigate over to the document section of the account and open up our simple folder structure. What will load for us is a preview of the document, as well as some supporting information. So in the top left, we can see the document's name and ID number. At the bottom, we can see the revision number and the date published. And in the top right, we see some buttons relating to the document, such as being able to access the document's properties, edit the document, or complete some other actions. A common struggle among businesses is managing the records of documents, so we are going to work through that process using IQM Essentials and talk about the benefits of managing them electronically. To do this, we click the Edit button. This opens up a field displaying who the editor of the document will be, as well as giving you the opportunity to provide a reason for editing the document. You then get the option to check the document out or edit it later. You can make changes to the document itself and add a comment for any changes that you've made. And on checking the file back into the system, you can see the comments you've made are brought in automatically into the changes field. All that's left to do then is release it for approval, or if you are the approver, approve the document. When next accessing the document, you'll notice updates have been made to the revision number and the date published. And for a record of all changes that have been made, these can be accessed via the Properties button, and in particular, the History tab. In addition to document management, the system also supports with the digital records of things like non-conformances and corrective actions. To access this, you go to the Workflow section of the account, and you're presented with a list of best-in-class workflows to support you with your needs. For an example, we can open up a non-conformance report. And we're presented with an electronic version of data capture, such as capturing the description of the issue and where it came from, and that all feeds into the process labeled down below. The relevant user is notified electronically and can log into the system to continue the process. From here, they're able to see any information that was entered previously, as well as to continue to process the non-conformance. And finally, a full log of all actions is kept for each record and can be found in the History tab at the top of the record.